the hell is that? That's my girl. Thanks, hon.
You're welcome.
It's a nice song.
It's my favorite. You're the greatest. See you, sport.
Afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to focus on the worst movies from the 1980s. When researching for our worst of the 80s, we took into consideration box office sales, critic reception, and fan reaction. We used the websites Rotten Tomatoes, IMDb, and others. It's also important to note that we're not talking about B movies or low-budget films. We're talking about movies that were supposed to be blockbuster hits by major motion picture companies. And with that, let's go. First on our list is Heaven's Gate. This was directed by Michael Cimino, starring Kris Kristofferson, Christopher Walken, John Hurt, Jeff Bridges, and Sam Waterston. Now this is a tough one as many people, at least now, tend to wholeheartedly like this Western. It's the story of a Harvard graduate, James Averill, who's played by Kris Kristofferson, who's the sheriff of a Jackson County, Wyoming town.
Telegraph, Kent! Have the proper warrants been issued?
The president himself asked for these men to go, Billy.
When a battle erupts between the area's poverty-stricken immigrants and its wealthy cattle farmers, with one critic stating it's a chaotic concert where it seems like the director wanted to make various different films, and another stating it's a bold and engrossing saga let down by controversy and scandal. So while it may be loved by some now, it was one of the biggest box office bombs in history and lost over $135 million in inflation-adjusted dollars. One reason is the budget spiraled out of control, with director Michael Cimino, who also directed Deer Hunter, requiring absurdly specific scenes to be done in the most expensive way possible. For example, he set up an irrigation system so fresh grass would grow for the movie's battle scenes, and he also had his staff take 6 weeks off to learn roller skating for one simple scene.
Les Capet was a freelance writer living in Montana. Early in production, he had requested access to the Heaven's Gate set. He was told that Heaven's Gate was closed, that Michael Cimino was not allowing any press. Rebuffed as a journalist, Capet applied for a job as an extra and worked on the movie for 2 months. He got $30 a day for his troubles and his story. Capet's article, which first appeared in the Los Angeles Times, painted a picture of excess and incompetence. Extras were fainting, horses were hurt, and there were all those takes of the same scene over and over again. Heaven's Gate, as Capet told it, was a farce, not a masterpiece.
The budget for this film was $44 million, which was quite a bit back in the day, and it raked in a whopping $3.5 million. Now, while it is rotten on Rotten Tomatoes, not by much, it has a 59% tomato meter score, which isn't too bad compared to some of the other films on our list. Bottom line is, Heaven's Gate is just a disorganized mess of a film. It has too many ideas that it's trying to squeeze into one movie, and it can't quite figure out what it is.
I told you so.
Now next, it was a close call in 1981 between INCHON and Mommy Dearest. But for the worst, we had to go with INCHON. Now, a gritty war movie, if done well, can be very intriguing. This, however, was not that. This movie has a 7% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes and a 0% tomato meter score.
With this message is contained my relinquishment of power granted to me as commander of the United Nations forces in Korea.
Star Laurence Olivier played General MacArthur, with one reviewer from Variety telling us that the film is unintentionally laughable. It's directed by Terrence Young, and aside from Laurence Olivier, it stars Jacqueline Bisset and Ben Gazzara. The budget was $46 million and it made $5.4 million. In an interview, Sir Laurence Olivier explained why he agreed to be in the cast. He said, "People ask me why I'm playing in this picture. The answer is simple. Money, dear boy. I'm like a vintage wine. You have to drink me quickly before I turn sour. I'm almost used up now and I can feel the end coming. That's why I'm taking the money now. I've got nothing to leave my family. but the money. And TV Guide says it's one of the worst films of all time, and I agree. This was financed by the Unification Church, also known as the Moonies Cult. INCHON was a massive box office bomb and is considered one of the worst movies ever made and the worst war movie, period. While it's meant to be an epic war film about the Battle of INCHON during the Korean War, the movie has some shockingly low budget values. In one scene, cardboard cutouts of fighter planes are held up by visible strings. Not only that, this film is 240 minutes long. That is 4 hours. Now this brings us to 1982, and honestly, this one kind of breaks my heart because I remember loving this film when I was a kid, and that is Grease 2. Now, I can vividly remember singing all the songs to this movie when I was a kid, and now looking back and going through those songs again, they're all pretty much about getting it on, so I can see how inappropriate that was for young Kevin back in 1982.
Give something to America you never gave before. Yeah, let's do it for our country. The red, white, and the blue. We're gonna score tonight. We're gonna score tonight. You say you're hungry for a lover. Gotta find a chick who'll give you more. Well, there's a spot that I've discovered where a guy's guaranteed to score.
This hit to the movie Grease starred Maxwell Caulfield, Michelle Pfeiffer, Adrian Zmed, and Lorna Luft. And there would be a few returning cast members, just not the ones you were hoping for. Frenchie, played by Didi Cohn, comes back, as well as the principal and office workers. Now this movie did make some money. Its budget was $11.2 million, and it made $15.2 million. Not quite the juggernaut they were hoping for. Some reviewers would say that it's aimless and horribly dull, with its vigorous group dances failing to compensate for the insipid songs. Basically, they tried to make a carbon copy of Grease and it just fails. It lost all the charm or characters and the freshness that made Grease popular. But like I said, when I was a kid, it was on, I watched it, because that's just what you did. If a movie was on, you just watched it, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. This movie has a 35% on the tomato meter score. But you know what? I don't care. I still like it. I'll still sing that bowling song while I'm walking around the house, or the Let's Do It for Our Country song, lasting on my Google Home. Seems like 3D comes back from time to time, and this is just the same in 1983. Now, while there was some improvement on the glasses and they weren't nearly as bad as the red and cyan glasses, the films that came out were not so great. I remember watching Star Chaser: Legend of Orin in 3D.
Like you've never seen it before. Star Chaser: The Legend of Orin in 3D, rated PG.
Jaws 3D, and our 1983 worst film, Amityville Horror in 3D. This film starred Tony Roberts, Lori Loughlin, and Meg Ryan. It had a budget of $6 million and only came in making $6.3 million. Now, while it may not have been quite as bad as Amityville in Space from 2022, it certainly was a bad movie.
Why are you wet? What happened? Susan? I'm talking to you.
Even when I watched it in the theaters, it just wasn't scary. With one reviewer saying it's basically characters arguing over storylines from previous Amityville movies. And let's not forget the 3D. You get to see wasps, furniture, and other random things flying at your screen. It's gimmicky and ridiculous. It would later be relabeled as Amityville the Demon. It has a whopping 18% on the tomato meter score, matching an 18% audience score. and it was clear they were just trying to cash in on the 3D craze. The overall storyline is it's about a family who moves into a house with a portal to hell in the cellar, resulting in some terrible special effects.
Now, its terror takes on a new dimension. As the horror reaches out beyond the edge of the screen.
This brings us to 1984. If there was ever a year that had a slew of bad movies, it would be 1984. In that year alone, we had Bolero, Sheena, Supergirl, Blame It on Rio, and more. But for my list, I'm choosing Rhinestone, if for no other reason, so I can hear Drinkenstein one more time.
Budweiser, you created a monster, and they call him Drinkenstein. And the tavern down the street is the laboratory where he makes the transformation all the time. And a stein of Dr. Bud is a pint of monster blood, and it does affect me different every time.
This comedy starring Dolly Parton and Sylvester Stallone has a 20% on the tomato meter and a 36% audience score. Now, I love Dolly Parton and I love Sylvester Stallone, but this was a misfire. And the synopsis, which is only one sentence, is this: a country music star must turn an obnoxious New York cabbie into a singer in order to win a bet. I'm gonna say that again. That's the plot of this movie. A country music star must turn an obnoxious New York cabbie into a singer in order to win a bet. And we haven't even talked about the Razzies yet, but this movie won too. Dolly Parton won for Worst Original Song for the previously mentioned Drinkenstein, and Worst Actor went to Sylvester Stallone. Dolly Parton plays the country singer that's stuck in a long-term contract performing at the Rhinestone Club, which is a sleazy urban cowboy nightclub. She says that she can turn any normal guy into a country singer in just 2 weeks. That normal guy would be Sylvester Stallone. If she wins the bet, the contract becomes void and she can leave the Rhinestone. If she loses, another 5 years will be added to the contract. I don't want to spoil it for you, but it all works out.
What's the difference?
The difference is it's my horse.
And I'll help you work hard if you help me.
So you got yourself a deal, cowgirl.
Now, unlike 1984, 1985 would have a slew of gigantic hit movies. In this year alone, we had Back to the Future, Beverly Hills Cop, The Goonies, National Lampoon's European Vacation, The Breakfast Club, Spies Like Us, The Jewel of the Nile, and plenty more. However, they weren't all great. If we take a look at the Razzie Awards for that year, it's our friend Sylvester Stallone nominated 2 times that year, for Rambo, First Blood Part 2, and Rocky IV. However, I'm not going to mess with Drago, so that's not my pick.
If he dies, he dies.
No, I'm going with the movie Fever Pitch. And no, not the delightful comedy starring Jimmy Fallon and Drew Barrymore. This one stars Ryan O'Neal and Catherine Hicks, and is directed by Richard Brooks. This one was rotten at 14% on the tomato meter, with a critic in Variety telling us, unfortunately, the plot is a totally unconvincing jumble and Ryan O'Neal as a sports reporter hooked on gambling is wooden and unsympathetic. And that's exactly what the movie is about. A sports writer played by Ryan O'Neal starts to gamble and gets deeper in debt under the guise of exposing the pitfalls of Las Vegas.
Gambling. Gambling.
Gambling.
Gambling. Gambling. Gambling. Gambling.
Now, this film had a budget of $7 million, and it made $343,000. It was a big loss and a bad film.
One more chance to save his life.
I'm a compulsive gambler.
Now, 1986 brings us to Howard the Duck. Ah, poor Howard. I sure did like this movie as a kid, but again, it's just one of those ones that was on and you watched it. Some call this the beginning of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. However, this movie was a dud. This has a 14% on the tomato meter on Rotten Tomatoes. Now the synopsis, and I'm gonna try to do this from memory. It's about a duck that gets hurled from space onto Earth and meets a girl who's in a band, and they kind of fall in love, and it's about him trying to get home. I think the biggest problem with this movie is they didn't commit to it being either a kid's film or an adult film. If you see scenes like this, it's silly and ridiculous and for kids. But then there's scenes like this.
I'm such a lucky girl in love.
And yes, the movie does have the uncensored version of that duck. And another thing that made it a little disappointing is the production company was Lucasfilms. And that means George Lucas was an executive producer on this disaster.
The idea was that there was going to be a future for them and for perhaps the movie. Maybe there'd be a sequel. Of course, it never happened. But we like to think that Howard and Beverly stayed together.
These men are pawns. I put a price of 20,000 dirham on their heads.
Next, they will be hailed as the two messengers of God.
1987 was another year that had quite a few stinkers. With Garbage Pail Kids the movie, Leonard Part 6, Who's That Girl? But I remember one movie that was all over the news and the papers as being just a disaster of a film. And that film would be Warren Beatty and Dustin Hoffman in Ishtar. Later, people would start to come around saying it's not such a bad movie. But in 1987, it was notorious for being the worst movie of the year. The story of this film is about two untalented nightclub performers who get caught in the crossfire when they are booked into the war-torn Middle East. Due to this, the duo finds them in the middle of a revolution. I mean, it sounds like a great plot and it's got great actors, it just fell short. This movie was directed by Elaine May, who previously written for Tootsie and Heaven Can Wait, so the expectations were high. I think this movie suffered from what I call the Waterworld effect, whereas the budget increased, people expected more, and it was already getting a negative reception before it was released. This movie had a $51 million production budget and another $20 million spent on prints and marketing costs. And when it was released, it made $4.2 million. Since then, it's totaled out at about $14 million. It is estimated to have lost at least $40 million and has become synonymous with the phrase box office flop. So while it was an okay film, negative press and budget costs is why it's perceived as one of the worst films ever made.
Ishtar, written and directed by Elaine May.
This is some of our best work.
And this brings us to 1988, when the average cost of eggs was 82 cents a dozen, and a house would cost you around $100,000. And it would also release one of the worst movies ever made, Mac and Me.
Hi, Michael. The thing I was telling you about, it's in the teddy suit.
Which is basically an hour and 40-minute long McDonald's commercial. Wanting to take advantage of the hit E.T., McDonald's got together and created Mac and Me.
Jumping in the city.
Okay, pick up the pace. That's very good, Kathy.
And that was not lost on critics and fans. And the product placement of McDonald's and Coca-Cola made this movie an atrocious disaster. The plot is about a family of aliens on a dying desert planet, and they search for water using this fantastic straw. A NASA research probe lands and begins taking samples via a suction device. The aliens are accidentally sucked into the apparatus probe and returned to Earth. And that is when Mac comes across Michael, and they soon become close pals. And the journey to reunite Mac with his family begins. And if you've ever come across this movie, the following clip is probably the one you remember the most. This movie is rated 1 star and has a 7% on the tomato meter and a 38% audience score, with one critic from People magazine saying it's a blatant commercial for McDonald's and Coca-Cola, disguised as an E.T. ripoff. The movie made around half its money back, with a $13 million budget and grossing roughly $6.4 million in the US. I mean, the big difference between this movie and E.T. is E.T. was actually kind of lovable and adorable. Mac, however, is a different thing altogether. I mean, just take a look at him. He's not exactly cuddly. 1989 would also have a pile of horrible movies. However, some that topped the list I just couldn't bring myself to say they were actually bad. Some examples are UHF, Tango and Cash, Uncle Buck. I love those movies. For my pick, it's Young Einstein.
If you could split the nucleus of a beer atom into two fragments, then the mass of the two fragments will be less than the mass of the original nucleus.
Young Einstein starring Yahoo Serious, which to this day I don't know how he ever became a thing, much less got his own movie. But here we are. It got a 36% on the tomato meter and a 50% audience score, so some people did like it. With one critic saying, considering the pre-opening build-up this film had, it could turn out to be a bigger bomb than the one Einstein's theory anticipated. This movie tells us an alternative reality tale for Albert Einstein. Yahoo Serious plays Albert Einstein, who grows up on an apple farm in Tasmania. He makes various scientific discoveries and winds up in plenty of unusual circumstances, even rescuing kittens from being cooked in a pie. And I guess that's all it takes to make a movie. However, one thing that saved this film is its low budget. It had a $5 million US budget and made $11.5 million in the US. Now, of course, totaling more than that, but that was back in 1989. And that's what I have for my worst. What's the worst movie you've ever seen? Speaking of movies that I love that maybe didn't do so great in the box office, let's continue the conversation with Flash Gordon over here. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thanks, friends.